Hello everybody and welcome to this, my first of 3 videos on the Konica Minolta Maxxum 7D, a camera I've actually really wanted to make a video about for a long time. The Minolta Maxxum, Konica Minolta Maxxum 7D is an interchangeable lens DSLR. What that simply means is it's a digital camera in an SLR form factor, which means there's a mirror behind this lens that goes up to a reflex pentaprism here that directs the light from the lens to your eye. And the lens can be removed and taken off and put a different one put back on at any point when you're not taking a photo with no issue. I do not recommend taking lenses off while you're taking photos. It has an APS-C format 6.3 megapixel CCD sensor. CCDs are nice in a lot of ways. They have some advantages over CMOS sensors of the same vintage, though modern CMOS sensors are better than vintage CCD sensors. It has a 14-segment honeycomb pattern multi-mode sensor. Now, what that means is if what you're looking at right now is what you're going to take a photo of, the camera has a honeycomb pattern in the metering area that divides this scene into 14 segments. And then it uses data from those 14 segments, such as brightness, darkness, distance, color, so on and so forth, to come up with a good meter reading for the camera. The shutter speeds are 30 seconds to 1/4000th with bulb and a 3 frame per second burst that will record up to 9 RAW files or 19 JPEGs before you underrun the buffer. And that is, by the way, for a camera of this vintage, pretty good. The viewfinder has 0.9x magnification and 95% coverage. So what that means is that when you look through the viewfinder, what you see is going to be 90% of the size of what will be on the sensor, and that about 2.5% on each side, in the top and the bottom, will be cut off in the viewfinder but will be on the sensor, which gives you a little bit of room to crop and post. The ISO range for this camera is 100 to 3200 plus in full stops, 3200 plus being, I think, just 3200. However, given this camera's age, I really don't recommend going above 400 and probably trying to keep this in the 1 to 200 range if you can, because digital noise will be pretty high if you push it much further. This camera does have an anti-shake function, and you can see the switch for that right here, on or off. The flash sync on that with this camera with the anti-shake on is 1/125th of a second and 1/160th of a second with the anti-shake off. Why that is, honestly can't tell you. And one last thing, this camera does not take video, it is stills only. Konica Minolta released the 7D with a target market of the high-end or pro user. And a big part of that was when this was released, DSLRs were still in their infancy, and most of the people buying them were people who would have previously bought high-end film cameras or professional film photographers. So this was a camera that was targeted at that market. It has exceptionally high build quality. This is an amazingly well-made camera. It was released at a price point that would be appropriate if you just took dollar for dollar and for a high-end camera today. This was so much money when it was released 20 years ago that it would still be considered an expensive camera, or the price that it sold for, which I don't have written down unfortunately, would still be appropriate for an expensive camera today, is what that means. And this has a feature set which roughly aligns with that of the Minolta Maxxum 7 in terms capabilities, layout, buttons, and things that it can do. This was made by Minolta in Malaysia from 2004 until 2006. It was preceded by nothing digital, though it does pull very heavily from the Maxxum 7 and to a lesser extent Maxxum 9 DSA. And why do I say a lesser extent Maxxum 9 DSA? I've had the 7 and the 9. And the 7 never felt this well made. The 9 feels almost this well made. This camera is incredible to hold. It was released concurrently with the 5D, which was a step down from this one. And it was followed by nothing immediately, although the Alpha 700 built on the platform, or at least the market segment for this camera, but didn't come out until a couple of years after this was discontinued. So now as we do, we'll go over the camera and take a look at what everything on the camera is. We'll start here technically on the side and the front with the strap lugs. And this is what you would connect your camera strap to. And you can see that this includes the little leather dudes. So you would run your strap or clip through here and to the split ring. And that would protect the finish on your camera from the split ring rubbing up against it as you carried it. Over here on this side, we have the exposure compensation dial and the exposure compensation dial lock. To move the exposure compensation dial, you push this button in the middle in, and then you can move it. If you don't push it in, you can't move it. This little white dot here is the exposure compensation dial index. This tells you what your exposure compensation is set to, whether it is set in third stops over on this side, or half stops. Was that right? Half stops on this side, or third stops over on this side. Okay. Underneath this dial, we have the flash exposure compensation dial. This doesn't have a lock, you can just adjust it, and you would use this dial to overclock or underclock your flash to get more or less power out of it when you use the flash, and there's a little index right there for it as well. Here we have the pop-up flash, which pops up that way. Just by no release button, you just lift it. Very mechanically reliable. Hot shoe. This camera, like the Maxxums of its time, uses the intelligent ISO hot shoe, so you would need a special IISO flash for this, or if you're going to use a standard flash, an IISO to standard flash adapter. The adapter option will take away a lot of your flash control capabilities. Mode dial index, mode dial lock button right here. Works exactly the same as the lock on the exposure compensation dial. This is your drive mode switch. There's a little index on the back, and you can switch between your different drive modes using this. Your options are single bracketing, continuous bracketing, single frame, continuous shooting, and 10-second self-timer. Next to that, there is an index here. That's your sensor plane index that you can use to take measurements off of for your exact sensor location. This is your white balance control switch. I don't think I've ever seen another camera that has a white balance control exactly like this. There may be others, and I just don't know of them, but I've not seen one where you switch between your white balance by pushing those by rotating this dial. Here's your shutter release button, and here's your front command wheel right here on the front. On the camera's front, we have a few things to look at. Konica Minolta logo, Konica Minolta badge, of course. The fact that the camera has stabilization built into it. Take the lens off for a moment so we get a better look. This is your self-timer light right here. Over here on this side of the mount is your depth of field preview button. Lens mount right here, lens mounting index, lens locking pin, lens release button, and this is your autofocus control right here. Single, automatic, continuous, or manual focus are your options. The way that these work is that in single autofocus mode, actually we'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about these in the second video. On this side of the camera, we have a few things to look at. Up here at the very top, we have the flash PC socket, standard flash release socket. Here we have a USB. Is that going to be right? No. We have a DC, a power connecting socket right there, so you can run off external power instead of battery. Here is the remote, so you can use a wired remote. I believe that's the same wired remote that the film era 7 and 9 used as well. That pin certainly looks familiar. On this side, we have a compound complex door. This is your USB connection right there, or video out. I keep thinking it's USB. It is a USB. It's got the USB symbol, but it's your USB for video out is what that does. We also have your card door right here, which we just lift up, and now you can get to your CF card. There you can see the USB port. I'm gonna guess, given the age of this camera, that that's probably a USB 1 port, though I couldn't find that specific information anywhere. On the camera's back, we have quite a bit. There's a lot going on back here. So this is your power button, on and off, a viewfinder, eyepiece sensors so that the camera knows when you put your eye up to the viewfinder. There's a wheel right here on the side of the housing, that's your diopter adjuster. This is your meter mode switch. What you do is you can switch this here between 3 meter modes, and we'll go over those in the second video. Auto exposure lock switch, autofocus manual focus switch, rear command wheel, menu button, LCD on-off button, zoom, delete, playback. This is your control wheel right here, your cross pad, your autofocus modes select, another autofocus type selector button right here. You can go between wide field, locking your autofocus, and your spot. We'll talk about how to use this in the second video. Memory set, that's M-set, memory set button right here. ISO to select your ISO, and then of course your stabilization on-off switch here, and then that right there is an access lamp to let you know when your CF card is being accessed or written to. On the camera's bottom, not a whole lot to see. Serial number, registrations, tripod socket, and your battery chamber so you can put your battery in your camera and use it. So let's talk about some things not to do with your Minolta Maxxum 7D. Don't touch the mirror behind the lens. That's a good way to get your finger oils on the mirror, which can tarnish it and affect your autofocus, or your focus and your metering. Also, don't touch the shutter, which is behind the mirror, because touching the shutter, your finger oils again can jam that shutter, or if it's got a bunch of leaves that overlap as it actuates and then go back into place. Well, if you push those leaves out of alignment, they can do this, and then they get jammed and ruin your shutter. The next thing is, don't leave your camera in your car. It is still a very nice looking camera, and it does look like a tempting theft target, so leaving your camera in your car, even if you just pop into the gas station to pay for your tank of gas, does mean you could come out to no camera and a broken window. But more importantly than that is that heat in your car can really have a negative effect on your digital cameras and the lubricating oils in their hardware and their housings as well. Lenses can have lubricating oil get on their aperture blades if it gets thin and then seeps onto them in the heat. Likewise, extreme cold can damage the housing material of digital cameras and can also break down the lubricating oil in your cameras and lenses, which will cause it to restrict moving part movement, and that's a pretty bad situation as well. Don't store it in a plastic bag or box unless you have a rechargeable desiccant pack for it, because plastic is moisture permeable, and once moisture gets into it, you can get fungus on your optics or in your prism. And the last thing is, don't let your camera get wet. I'm not 100% certain if this is weather sealed or not, but if it is, that weather sealing's closing in on 20 years old very fast, and I would not perhaps trust it quite as much as I did when it was brand new. The same thing would go for very dusty environments. Just remember that your Minolta Maxxum D 7D is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect, and as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that was video 1. Video 2, we're going to talk about most everything and how to use it. In video 3, we're going to go through the menu system and talk about how to completely set this camera up. I'll see you in video 2.